Thank you so much. Really honored to be even the first speaker of the semester. And yes, I will talk today about rational inattention and try to convince you that our new concept of ignorance equivalence can help us answer new questions and might be helpful to think about these situations. This is joint work with two macroeconomists, Armenter at the Philly Fed, hence the disclaimer, and Stangebye, who's my former colleague at the University of Notre Dame. By way of introduction, what we're globally thinking about is just sort of uncertainty, and I would say the biggest revolution of the 20th century was realizing how important and really crucial uncertainty is to model, predict, interpret real-world choices. But I think it's still true in many game theory or multiplayer models that we have a rather passive view of how this information gets around. It's sort of when people observe information, they immediately absorb all the available information, but they can't really, or often cannot, choose which information they want to seek out. And this is why I'm very excited about the rational inattention field, because it both has a very flexible view of learning, where you're not just choosing how much information you want to get, but what type of information you want to acquire. And also it acknowledges that this information is costly, so you'll do a cost-benefit analysis before determining what to learn. And so what our main contribution in this paper is to propose a new concept, which we call ignorance equivalent. And what I'll try to convince you is that it's sort of a parsimonious summary that's helpful in decision problems with flexible learning. And then I'll also get to why this should interest people that do market design. In a nutshell, the case I'm trying to make is that being able to learn is kind of as if you would have access to additional actions. So that's the basic comparison that will come out. And that in that sense, if anybody has a question in chat, please raise your hand, because it did just pop up, but I cannot see what it is. So that in that sense, the ignorance equivalent is kind of like the certainty equivalent that we have for lotteries, and so hopefully it could be similarly important in the future. And then we want to apply that also to multiplayer settings. So briefly, the way I've structured this talk is I'll first spend a few slides on what rational inattention is, how I want you, the type of picture I want you to have in your mind. And then I'll try to outline how that's relevant for contract design, sort of a two-player market design, and then maybe more general market design before I get to the ignorance equivalent and sort of the theory. So very simplest choice environment is an action that has to choose one out of finitely many actions from a menu which I describe as script A. And then that action will yield a state-dependent utility. I'll use sort of shorthand notation in the sense that I'll label the action directly by the state-dependent payoffs that you attained. So if you pick action A, you actually get utility AI in state I. And then I also have to say what is the agent's prior belief over these different states, and I'll denote that by pi. So in the simplest sense, you have these type of pictures where you draw the states, two or more on the axis, and then you can place each possible action as a point that specifies the possible payoffs in each state. If you want to go even more concrete, you could think of an investor who has some wealth that he can place. And then let's assume that there are 3 possible portfolios that he could invest in. Then if he invests his money into portfolio 3 here, so the 2 states could be that the market goes up or down. In that case, portfolio A3 here would be a pro-cyclical portfolio. Portfolio A2 would be a safe portfolio, and portfolio A1 would be a counter-cyclical portfolio. So question, yes. Simon? Can you unmute yourself? Okay. All right. Now, just as a baseline, if there is no learning possible, we just have no information. The agent has to go with his prior. As you probably all know, what the agent will do in this case is to just maximize expected utility, which corresponds to looking in the direction of his prior belief and taking the highest action in that direction. If the agent can learn for free, then he would, if he could learn for free, he would just learn the state and in that case, pick the highest one in that state. If the agent can learn something, a less informative signal for free, so a situation of incomplete information, then we use Bayes' rule. So then the agent would observe the signal, update the beliefs, depending on whether he observed signal plus, maybe that's indicative of state 1. Agent is now more shorted state 1 and will maximize in the direction of his posterior. In the opposite signal realization, he would be more short state 2 and opposite update, maximize in that direction. So that would represent what he would do under incomplete information. And so now rational inattention basically just inserts one more thing at the beginning where the agent chooses which signal among all possible signals he actually wants to take. So basically, he could take the same signal as before, but maybe he would instead choose to take a less informative signal, which I've indicated here. That signal is less informative, so he moves the beliefs a little less, but it would also be less costly. So each signal is mapped to a cost, and the agent before observing the signal chooses which signal he wants to observe from. That's the basic idea of rational inattention. And then we define the agent's welfare as the expected consumption utility, which will be higher if we draw the more informative signal, of course, minus the cost of the signal. And so it's the cost ultimately that discourages possibly getting full information because it might be very expensive to do so. Now, in terms of the strategy space, when we introduce this choice of a signal, the strategy space sort of blows up. Rather than just choosing an action or even an action in each signal realization, he now has to choose a whole signal distribution. And so a priori, he could take any conditional signal that can yield different messages with state-dependent probabilities. It is well known that we can use the obedience principle here and just restrict attention to signals that recommend specific actions. And so running strategy is just signal recommends an action, and then the agent takes the recommended action, which slightly simplifies our strategy space, because now we basically have to just choose the state-dependent choice probabilities. Okay, so that's what I'll call a learning strategy. And in terms of the cost, we have a specific axiomatization of which costs work with different properties. But the simplest summary that will allow us to fit our time here is that you can think of any cost that's differentiable and prior concave, uniformly posterior separable. So those are costs that are on this shape. Basically, you can sort of think of a function phi that encompasses how much knowledge do you have when you have a specific belief. And so then the cost of a signal is sort of the expected increase in your knowledge. Costs that fit this structure include many of the most famous examples in the literature. In particular, the mutual information, which is almost always chosen in applied rational inattention papers. Okay, but that was pure decision theory, one agent choosing from one menu. Now I'd like to show a little bit as to where this could apply in market design. And I'll first go with a two-player and then a multiplayer situation. And just for concreteness, I phrased this all in terms of investment, but that's just pure framing. You could apply it to many other settings. So, for example, suppose that we have, as before, this risk-neutral investor who wants to place his wealth. So we had this picture before. Let's assume by himself he has access to 3 portfolios. And maybe just to clarify, these 3 portfolios, because it's different actions, he would really have to place all his wealth in one of the portfolios. If he could mix and match between the portfolios, you should add additional points that represent the mixed portfolios. Okay? So he has just these 3 options on the picture, but you could make this with more than 2 states and finitely more portfolios. But he's not by himself. There is also in the market a fund manager. I call her she. She would like to place the wealth for him. Okay? we're going to assume, that the manager can offer this investor any payouts. Payouts are just nothing else than saying, if the state 1 realizes, I'm going to pay you alpha 1. If the state 2 realizes, I'm going to pay you alpha 2. So any possible promises are possible and also enforceable. And we're going to assume for right now, just for the sake of concreteness, that the manager can learn for free. So if the manager gets the investment, then of course he will invest in asset portfolio A3 in state 1 and A1 in state 2. And now we can ask ourselves, well, what's the first best? Not surprisingly, because the investor has a cost for learning and the manager does not. The first best payouts are all those that are high enough so that the investor always accepts. Because in those situations, we have no wasteful learning expenses, and the more able agent always does the placement. But that might not be what the fund manager wants to do. If you want to think about what the fund manager would do here, it's a little bit more complicated, because as the fund manager determines what payoffs or payouts she wants to offer, she has to take into account that the investor will always be free to sort of deviate to learn, and first learn a little bit and then determine if this is even interesting for him, and possibly take it in some situations where it's good for him but not so good for her. So she has to really carefully design this portfolio or these payouts, and not just think about the expected wealth that the investor will be left with, but exactly how much he'll get in each state. And so globally, if you would want to solve this as a contract design problem, you'd think about sort of 2 classes of possible payouts that you could offer. The first option is, of course, you could offer payouts that are high enough so that the investor will always accept. Just set that as a constraint. You want to make sure that the investor unconditionally accepts the offer, and then try to maximize how much surplus the manager can retain. Ideally all, but maybe that's not possible. Maybe most is what you go for. Or you could say, well, let's give up on always trade. Doesn't necessarily need to be first best. Maybe you want to do something with partial trade. And then, because it could be that then maybe you don't get the business always, but when you do, you actually earn more. Now we'll have to learn a little bit more about ignorance equivalence before I can tell you what actually happens. I just want to give you a preview. Basically, what we'll show is that in this situation, what will happen in the equilibrium is that the manager will find terms that implement unconditional trade. So the first best will be realized here. And in fact, it will be done in such a way that the manager is able to retain all surplus. The investor is no better off than under autarky, but there is surplus to be made, and that surplus goes to the manager. So that's a little bit of market design. But maybe it's a little bit too stylized, and you can sort of see how it ties in with ignorance equivalence. And there's no learning in the end at all, only by the manager who has this perfect learning. So it's maybe not that interesting. So let's go one step further. Still phrase it in terms of this investor who has his wealth to place. But instead of one fund manager, there's now a whole host of different fund managers. And we'll make all these fund managers different in many, many important aspects. First, each manager will have a different cost to learn about the state. So you can think about a multidimensional state. And maybe some of these fund managers are experts in different industries. And it will be easier for them to distinguish some states that are concerned with a specific industry versus other states where they don't know so much about. So they could have different information costs when it comes to discerning between different states. And then maybe some of these fund managers, even in a 2-state example, maybe some of these fund managers have really good intuition. When I think about good intuition, I would say good intuition means it's cheap for you to get sort of a core signal. Comes very cheap. You have just good intuition. But that doesn't necessarily make it cheap for you to get accurate information. Conversely, some fund managers, maybe the same, maybe different fund managers, have really good research skills. They have the right departments and they can know the right information sources that they can get precise signals comparatively cheaper. So that's what I think is so cool about rational inattention. You have all these things that can come into the learning cost. It's really a very flexible framework. And so these managers, their learning technology can differ on many different grounds. And of course, the investor might also possibly be able to learn in some way the way he was before. Now, I'm going to add one more heterogeneity between these managers, or these all the agents. I'm also going to assume that they all have access to possibly different investment vehicles. So you could think about the investor having access to some company's stock options, but only if he invests directly. Or maybe some of these asset managers have access to hedge funds or venture capital funds, where the investor cannot get to unless he goes through them. So now we have a situation with many different menus, if you want. And the question is, so here I've sort of sketched something like that. You could think about the agent having the golden dots. He could invest into those three if he wants to. And then one manager has access to the green circles, and another one has access to the crosses. Okay? So we have different menus, and then we have also these different cost functions. At this point, I don't even know how to sketch this on the graph. Okay? So the first question that we could ask ourselves from a market design perspective is, what would the first best look like here? It's not clear who will invest, and likely what we need is a sort of complete, complicated contingency plan of first calling upon one manager to learn something, maybe somebody with a really good intuition because they can get a rough signal quickly. Depending on what they find, we ask industry expert A or industry expert B to learn more about their respective industries. And then maybe they find something, then maybe we need to call yet another manager because he has access to a hedge fund that we'd really like to invest in. If we found something else, we'll give it back to the investor to invest in company stock options. It's the first best itself can be quite complicated and will typically involve learning from possibly many different people, and then ultimately will end with somebody placing the money. But there needs to be just the right agent that has access to this portfolio. Any questions so far? That's the setup. Yeah.
Sure. A question is, so like as we go along, we update our priors, right? I understand. As we ask different managers, they get their knowledge in, and we understand a bit more. But what happens if I ask a manager at time 2, and then I have asked another manager at time 4? Can I go back and give them money to agent at time 2, manager at time 2 to do the investment? Or
so you are already thinking ahead to the implementation. Okay, but very relevant, but I haven't said anything so far. Okay, so if you're just thinking about the first best, in a sense, how we make it doesn't yet enter. But just to clarify, yes, the first best could absolutely be so that we first go to manager 2 to learn something, then he finds something, that condition, we go to manager 4, and then we go back to the investor and go back and forth. That could totally happen. And it's also quite clear in the first best, all information will be public, and so later people will know what the earlier people learned. So that for the first best, we're sort of clear about the structure?
I think so. Yeah.
But then we want to think about the implementation. And so broadly, the question that we want to ask here, can it be implemented through trade? Which is what you hinted at, okay? And so what we'll allow for is to agents, when they trade, similar to the example before, they can make these state-dependent transfers. And ultimately, once the investment is done, the state will realize and all these transfers are due. So we'll assume that for most of the talk, that state-dependent transfers are possible. And then it could be something like that. Okay, so we have one agent who promises something. Those payments will remain due even if it goes on to another agent. So once then the state realizes all the previously made promises have to be paid out. That's broadly the structure that we'll assume. And we want to figure out, is that possible? If at this point you're like, how? I cannot even answer that question. That's your gut feeling, then I'm very glad because then I will hopefully be more able to convince you that ignorance is a goal and is helpful. Okay? So that's our quick preview of the results. I said that this talk is going to be about how to think of learning ability as representing vicious payoffs. I'm going to formally define in a few slides what I call the learning proof menu, which is basically the equivalent payoff. In payoffs, what does your technology of learning unlock? What additional payoffs does it unlock? And so just into as a brief sketch here, what that will allow me is to add to the picture lines that represent the learning technology of each agent. You don't have to understand anything more at this point, okay? So I will be able to draw lines like that, and I'll come back to it. That equivalence between payoffs and learning will also allow me to give sort of a reduced form description of what the first best plan will look like. I can talk about what the learning cost and the menu of the social planner is, and I can sort of represent his payoff possibilities on the same graph, and obviously they will be better than anything that individual agents can do. And then I will talk about how together they can actually, the answer here is affirmative, assuming learning is public, and I'll make that more concrete towards the end. They can actually implement the first best through trade, which I would say wasn't immediately obvious before. Okay, so I hope this was my best take to get market designers interested about decision theory. So if you want to know more about this, we will now take it back to the decision theory view, one agent, per menu, per cost, per prior, and talk about how we define the ignorance equivalent. Okay? Here's the definition. So again, this is the choice problem for the individual agent, her menu, her prior belief, and her cost function. I will define for this choice, for each choice problem, an ignorance equivalent, and that will be a payoff vector with two properties. First of all, the payoff vector needs to be attractive enough that the agent is willing to commit to always implement it. If I use the notation I introduced before, the welfare that the agent gets, if he only has access to this one possible action, so she has to implement the ignorance equivalent, then she gets just as much welfare as if she can choose from her original menu. So this is the maximum welfare that she gets if she can choose any signal and then implement any action in her menu. Another way of saying that is that the ignorance equivalent needs to be attractive enough that the agent would be willing to forego any learning opportunities that were in her original menu. Huh? At the same time, there is a counterpart to this. The ignorance equivalent cannot be too attractive. And what I mean here specifically is that the agent needs to also be willing to commit to never implement alpha. If I phrase that again in terms of preferences over menus, when the agent has access only to her original menu, she should get just as much welfare as if she has access to both her original menu and the new ignorance equivalent. Because in this menu, she could do more complicated things. She could choose to learn something and then determine if she wants to take one of her original actions or this new action. So this could be very attractive, but alpha cannot make this any better. So another way to state the second property is that the ignorance equivalent has to be not too attractive so that the agent is also willing to forego any new learning opportunities that arise when I add it to the menu. If a payoff vector satisfies both of those properties, then I will call it the ignorance equivalent of the choice problem. Now, you might be wondering about these inequalities. If you do, then all the better, because indeed, it's true that when you have access to a larger menu, you can always do weakly better. So this one has to be bigger than this one, for example. And so if they both hold, indeed, not just are they ordered, actually the agent is exactly indifferent between these three menus. So you could also have defined the ignorance equivalent as a payoff vector that satisfies this menu indifference. So the agent is just as well off when she has access only to the ignorance equivalent, or than she is when she has access to only her original menu, and she's also equally well off when she has access to both of them. That's the ignorance equivalent. And then our first result is to show that, in fact, such an ignorance equivalent always exists and always is unique for any cost in the prior concave uniformly posterior separable class, differentiable. Okay. So you can find for any choice problem a payoff vector that achieves the same expected utility as what you could get as a welfare if you would go forth and choose from the original menu. At the same time, when you sort of plug it in as an additional option, it doesn't make you any better off. Anything you was optimal before is still optimal. Okay? So in a sense, adding the ignorance equivalent doesn't distort your prior choice. You would be willing to now not learn, but you're also still willing to learn the same way as before. And you can construct it either from the optimal signal or from the UPS cost potential. I've cut those out to make more time for market design, but if there are questions, I'll be happy to go into those slides either now or at the end. All right. There are several properties that we derive in the paper, and I've concentrated here the ones that are most relevant for what we're doing after. The first thing to note is that the ignorance equivalent of a rational inattention problem, in fact, ends up characterizing all optimal learning strategies without reference to beliefs. The formal result is that if you would compare two agents that have the same access to the same menu, same cost, but possibly different priors, so they may think differently about the world when they start. It turns out that they act the same way, so their state-dependent stochastic choice is exactly the same if and only if they also have the same ignorance equivalent. Okay. In 2 dimensions, cases where this happens are only the cases where both agents would in fact unconditionally choose one of the available actions. So it's maybe not that interesting. But in more dimensions, you can have agents that differ in belief in some dimension. Both are learning, but the difference in belief isn't relevant to the choice that they're making. And so they might still act exactly the same way. So it's sort of an easy way to check whether two people behave the same way, because you can characterize it as an I-dimensional vector. The second property is that the ignorance equivalent can be helpful when you're trying to determine whether a new action makes the agent better or worse off. So if I want to figure out, does the agent get better off, get additional welfare if I add a new action A+ to her menu? So would the investor be better off if I add a new portfolio? And equivalently, if I add the new portfolio, it'd be optimal for the agent to sometimes at least choose it. Okay, so that could be interesting both on welfare grounds, but also you would want to figure out, would it be attractive and would he pick it? Well, to determine that, it's not straightforward, because if A has a lot of portfolios already, a lot of actions, then you would have to think through learning strategies that have cardinality of A plus 1 possible signals. So it's very complicated. It's a very complicated beast to figure out, to check all learning strategy, all joint probabilities between these A+1 actions and figure out if one of them is better than what was the best before. Now, luckily, the ignorance equivalent, if you know the ignorance equivalent of the original problem, you can do this by checking only for binary learning strategies, because we have a result that says that this new action will be welfare enhancing when added to your full menu. So this here. If and only if it's also welfare enhancing when you add it just to the ignorance equivalent. So now you only have to check menus that contain the ignorance equivalent and A+. If that welfare is larger than what you get if you have to implement alpha, then you have welfare gains, and then you would implement it also sometimes in the original menu. So it allows us to sort of not have to worry about too complicated learning strategies. And that's going to be a general theme. Okay. So if you think about computation in particular, any questions have to do with computation, this can really give you a lot of efficiency gains. Because thinking about complicated learning strategies is just very taxing. A third property that is important is that adding the ignorance learning adding the ignorance equivalent will not make the agent better off. That's by definition. But also it will not make any other agent better off, even if the other agent has a different prior. So formally we show that if we have some other agent with some other prior pi prime, that agent would still do the same if I add the ignorance equivalent under prior pi. Okay? And this is true even if, so obviously it's true if agents with the two priors have the same ignorance equivalent. If they have the same ignorance equivalent, then it's again by definition. But it could be that Marion thinks the market is surely going to go, almost surely going to go up, and I think it's almost surely going to go down. You could be pretty sure in those situations, her optimal investment will actually be different from my optimal investment. Okay? But what this means is if we compute Marion's ignorance equivalent, it will be some payoff vector that's, she thinks the market's going to go up. So her ignorance equivalent will be pro-cyclical. And we add this pro-cyclical asset to my menu, it will not make me any better off. Okay? We call this the self-selection property because it opens up the possibility of adding all the ignorance equivalents across all priors to the menu. And then still the optimal choice of no agent will be deformed. Okay? So this is what we do here. This is what gives us the learning proof menu. I've talked about it before. Here's what it actually is. So you take the menu and you compute all the ignorance equivalents under all possible priors, and you just trace them out. Here is the green line. There's a two-state, two-action problem. And then if I compute the ignorance equivalents, it gives me this green line. The nice thing is that when I think now about the agent choosing from this learning proof menu, the choices that they did with just the black dots are still optimal. Okay, they were not better off. So they're just as well off if they have to pick from just the black dots than if they have access to all the whole green line. But with the green line, they're also always willing to forego learning. No matter what your belief is, you're willing to unconditionally pick something from the green line because your ignorance equivalent is right there. Okay? And so you can think of the learning proof menu as sort of a standard expected utility representation of the problem with learning. If you have access to the green line, learning is, there's no extra gains from learning, so you might as well forget about it. At the same time, if you only have access to the black line and you can learn, you get the same welfare as if you had access to the green line. Okay? And so that's where the ability to learn is as if you were choosing from the green line rather than from the black line. One example where this learning proof menu can be helpful is because it also allows us now in a very simple way to determine how much the agent will be willing to pay for some exogenous information. So if they can learn endogenously, we want to figure out how much would they be willing to instead just get the signal right made. We can just use our standard ways of computing welfare if learning is impossible. If we have a signal, this is the prior, and we think about a signal where the belief updates either slightly towards state 2 or slightly towards state 1, then we can just figure out how much would a person gain from that signal if they had access to the green menu but could not learn. And that's just taking tangents and then seeing how much higher the crossing is than the line you had before, the maximum expected utility you had before the signal. That gain in welfare is exactly how much the rational inattentive agent would be willing to pay. Again, in 2 dimensions, there are other ways you don't need this. But in many dimensions, it's interesting because, of course, more accurate information is still typically more useful for the agent, but only if the agent also has actions that allow her to exploit it. There is information that you can give to a rationally inattentive agent that's just not actionable because she cannot act on it, given her menu. And so this takes into account which information is actionable, and also how costly would it be for her to procure that information through other means, through her own learning technology. So that's one sort of immediate way in which the learning proof menu can be helpful. Any questions? Okay, let's go back to market design. Let's go back to the motivating examples I gave before. On both slides, we generalized them. And although I won't give you full proofs, hopefully I can show you how it connects with the results that I've outlined before. So the first example was this contract design. And I'm trying to sort of hint at the fact that this is larger than just investment. Let's just think about a zero-sum game where we have initially some agent with access to an opportunity. That means the possibility to choose from a menu. In this case, it's this investment opportunity that's given by his money. It initially belongs to agent one. And he could hand over that opportunity or hand over his wealth to a more powerful agent. Initially, we assumed that the more powerful agent is this manager, and we assumed the more powerful agent can learn for free and has access to the same opportunities. Well, slightly enlarged that, let's assume the more powerful the manager can actually still have a cost, but it should be weakly lower than the agents, and to be interesting, at least sometimes strictly lower. And the manager also might have additional options that the agent cannot access. So think of hedge funds or other funds where you cannot place your wealth directly. We can even introduce a third agent that could be an intermediary. Maybe in some situations, the agent one cannot directly hand over the opportunity to agent two. The wealth has to go through some platform, for example. And that platform might not be able to place anything. So they might have an empty opportunity set, but they can surely buy opportunities and sell opportunities. They can participate in this whole trading scheme. Okay. And now, so that's the picture that we had before. Hopefully it's intuitive that still the first best is still very easy to characterize here. Okay, we have one agent who's just better at everything than everybody else. The optimal thing is for that person to do the learning and then for that person to execute the opportunity, i.e. place the wealth. Okay, and so if we want to ask ourselves, can we implement that through trade? We can actually, based on the tools, on the results that I showed before, characterize all terms that would implement such unconditional trades. So those are all the payoff vectors that the agent one would be willing to sell unconditionally, and agent two would be willing to buy unconditionally. It's roughly a shape that looks something like that. Why the key reason why we constructed is this fact that we only have to think through ignorance equivalent and one other action. So it's really this breaking it down from more complicated learning strategies to just binary strategies that gives us a lot of tractability here. And I've drawn it in two states just because I'm not good at multidimensional drawings, but the proof is for any number of portfolios and any number of dimensions. Finite. Okay? And so when we have that set of first best implementing trades terms, we can highlight a few particular ones. For example, we could trade, agent one could give her wealth directly to agent two at terms dictated by his ignorance equivalent. That would implement the first best, because by definition, agent one is willing to unconditionally sell. And also by that definition, he is no better off. So the full surplus accrues to agent two. Okay. I haven't formally argued why agent two cannot do better. This is actually what would happen if you implement this as a game and agent two, this manager, has all the negotiation power. The only thing I have to argue is why wouldn't it be better to do something with partial trade? And here the idea is if partial trade were optimal, then agent one would still have to get at least as much as in autarky, in expectation. And if he also learns that in sort of consumption utility needs to be even higher. And so there is less that can remain for the agent two. So a bit vague, but that's the basic idea. Okay? Or put maybe in more economically meaningful terms, the reason why agent two doesn't want to offer something that leads to partial trade is that if he were to do that, then agent one would learn something and always come and give the manager the money when he's adversely selected. He would buy the stock or the fund that the manager offers when it's good for the agent and bad for the manager. So he doesn't want that. He'd rather have unconditional trade. And then, of course, extract the full surplus. And it turns out he can do that. Another point that's in this set is the ignorance equivalent of the manager. Here it's just the highest point in the yellow set. If the manager can learn for free, it's the point that is up from A3 and over from A1. Okay? So this is a little bit more general. It costs something for the manager to learn here. In that situation, all is first best, but all surplus goes to agent one. So that would be the equilibrium outcome if the investor has all the negotiation power. And we could also ask ourselves what happens if the platform, if the intermediary agent has all the negotiation power, then she could get the full surplus by offering to buy the wealth from agent one at his ignorance equivalent, and then selling it to the manager at the manager's ignorance equivalent. Okay? And there are, of course, intermediate situations that would also implement first best, where the surplus would be split somehow. Now, the nice thing from having not just sort of the levels of wealth and the overall surplus quantity that's realized and who it goes to, but having the actual state-wise description of the terms, is that we can also ask ourselves, what happens if the state remains unverifiable? If the state remains unverifiable, even ex post, then we cannot write contract terms that are state dependent. I really like your nodding. Then what that would correspond is we have to ask ourselves, what if I cannot offer these points because they're off the diagonal? What if I can only offer terms that are on the diagonal? And we can just check, is the first best still implementable? In situations where this yellow area, and again, the recipe for how to construct it is in the paper, touches or overlaps with the diagonal, then you can even implement the first best with unverifiable states. Here, where it does not, that would mean that if states are unverifiable, then also the first best becomes unattainable through trade. And then we have worked out one specific example to show that it can actually happen. And in those situations, the manager is better off not offering something that's always accepted, but offering something that's only sometimes accepted, but sort of then really getting a good, in the cases where he's accepted, really getting a good profit. Any questions? All right. Then let's go to the other example. So here, again, we have allocation of an opportunity that needs to happen. It could be an investment opportunity that's given by some wealth that needs to be placed. Initially, it belongs to some agent, but it could be traded among many agents. And each agent may have a different opportunity set, so things that he can do if he decides to execute the opportunity, or funds where he could place the wealth, and possibly different costs of learning. Now, here we'll make one additional assumption related to the information, because we don't want to simultaneously treat incentives to learn the right amount and to tell the truth. So we sort of decouple from them by assuming that if you can learn at any time, nobody has to give you permission to learn. But when you learn something, everybody can observe the results. Okay? This is a literature that's been made in other papers that have to do with learning. And so the nice thing if we make that assumption is that if all agents start out with the same prior and everybody observes all that's being learned, all agents at each point in time have the same beliefs. Okay? But of course, still the key complication is that we have to, if we want to implement it in a decentralized way through trade, we always have to worry about agents sort of not accepting something unconditionally that we might want to have them accept unconditionally. So the first thing that we can do is we can draw in these lines now. So the learning proof menu allows us to represent what do these agents look like still in the same graph. So here, the initial investor might be the yellow, I said, the gold one. He has access to these through actions. If I draw his learning proof menu, I find this, which immediately tells me that if this agent is in autarky, has to choose only among the yellow ones, he would never even invest into this one. He'd always be better off just learning a little bit and then picking one of those two portfolios. But this one's not chosen. But turns out that one is in fact available to everybody. It's just putting the money under the mattress. Everybody can do that. And then I have two investors here, the green one, two managers, and the red one. Another thing I can see here is that if you look at the green line, it's sort of more curved than the yellow line. That hints at the fact that the green agent can learn cheaper than the yellow agent in the way that I've drawn it. Okay, because if you can learn for free, then your learning curve menu moves up and out until it's the sort of hypercube. If you cannot learn it, it goes down and down and down until it becomes the upper convex hull. Okay, so the curvature of the learning curve menu has something to do with your learning cost. But of course, learning is not as simply as saying it's cheap or expensive, right? Some things might be cheap, some things might be expensive for different agents. But so that's what I get here. And then I can also describe what would be the planner here. So the planner, if he can tell everybody what to learn in which order and which conditional learning plan, and can also tell when which agent has to become active and end the game by implementing one of his actions. And basically the planner has access to the menu that's the union over all agents. And he also has access to what Little and Zong call the indirect cost. So if he just implements a particular signal, he can always learn that signal at the cheapest cost because he can tell the right agent to learn it. And moreover, over these signals, he can optimize overall sequential acquisitions. So it might not be optimal to have one agent acquire one signal, but one agent acquire a noisy signal, depending on what he finds, other agent acquire something until together they have constructed this mega signal. Okay? And so it's very nice for us that we can draw upon their characterization. They show that this indirect cost should have well exists and also is within the UPS family. Yeah? So if we would represent it over here, the planner would just be a person with access to all the points and a very low learning cost. So his learning curve menu will be even more round or even more pointing towards the top right, something like this dashed line here. Okay. And so now, without proof, what we show is that the agents can implement this as a perfect Bayesian-Nash equilibrium through repeated trade. Essentially what happens, they all start at some prior, and the trading protocol is always at the belief where we're currently at, is the opportunity is traded at the point that maximizes it on the planner's learning curve menu. So if we start at some belief and the planner says, agent 1, please hand over your opportunity to agent 3, agent 1 would be willing to do that at this price. And then agent 3 gets it at this price. Now agent 3 is supposed to learn something. Because agent 3 has the lowest cost, that comes out of this paper, agent 3 would be willing to do that if he or she is guaranteed to be able to resell at the prices again given by this learning curve menu. And so in that way, whatever outline, whatever contingency plan the planner would implement is at each point also individually rational for each agent that's either has the opportunity or is supposed to take over the opportunity if the trades are always done on this line or in multiple dimensions on this surface. So in a sense, this learning curve menu doesn't just help us sort of abstract away from learning. It also helps us make sure that just the right amount of learning is undertaken by just the right agent. Okay, so I haven't given you the proof, but I hope you get a little bit of the intuition and maybe get curious to read the paper. So in conclusion, why do I think it might be possibly justified to claim that the ignorance equivalent does similar things to the very famous certainty equivalent? As you all know, the certainty equivalent is used when we talk about preference over risky choices. And essentially what it does is it condenses the information of a lottery where you might win many possibly different prizes with some given probabilities, and it summarizes that into a single scalar. The certain lottery that you would be just indifferent to if you had to choose between that one and your original lottery. And it's very powerful because it's very useful to compare across lotteries given a fixed belief. Okay. But in a sense, it is too parsimonious then for situations with learning because it abstracts away from the state dependence. So each point that I throw on each portfolio, you can think of it as a lottery if you have a fixed prior, right? You can either learn this much if the state ends up being state 1, and you can learn this much if the state ends up being state 2. So the certainty equivalent basically summarizes a point in a number given by what would be the certain amount that gives you the same expected utility. But because it abstracts away from where the point lies in this 2D or in multiple dimensions state, it also is no longer able to really tell you much about what your optimal learning should be. It captures something about the welfare maybe, but then it's not useful if you want to evaluate when I add new actions, are they attractive to me or not? Because new actions are only then attractive, either they are so high payoff that you would pick them always, or maybe they are not very high payoff, but they make it worthwhile for you to go and learn something because now in one particular contingency, you have an attractive option. In other contingencies that might come out, you already had attractive options. And so when we have an agent who can learn, this tailoring between choice and state is the central thing, and then certainty equivalence doesn't retain enough information. And so the ignorance equivalent goes one step less far. Rather than sort of combining all the points, each point into a scalar and then comparing the scalars, we combine all the points into one vector. So all the menu is characterized by a single payoff vector, but that vector is still state dependent. And because it's still state dependent, and it retains just enough detail to capture the learning opportunities that were there in the original menu. And so, for example, it allows us to determine whether adding a new action is welfare enhancing or not. Okay, you have more learning opportunities in the full menu. And so when I said you add a new action is to make you better off, if it makes you better off, then only if it also makes you better off compared to the ignorance equivalent. But it can be that the absolute welfare gains are larger with your full menu. Okay, but on a qualitative level, are you better off when I add a new action? You don't have to worry about the full menu. You can only think about this one payoff vector as a summary. And it also becomes useful when we compare across beliefs, because we can represent all these ignorance equivalents as the learning proof menu, and then we don't have to worry about the learning anymore. And so there will be a little bit of time for questions at the end because I'm on my last slide. I hope to have convinced you, first of all, explained enough so that you feel confident that you know what this ignorance equivalent is. It's a payoff vector that summarizes the menu, and it has the property that you are just indifferent between your original menu, having to choose this ignorance equivalent, or being able to choose between both. That it does a few things well. Namely, it simplifies our intuition about these general class of problems, that it yields novel insights when it comes to comparative statics, and that it's not just a sort of a mental shortcut that is a tool for analyzing problems, but it is really an economically relevant concept because it comes out in the equilibrium of either contract design or market design games. And it's helpful, of course, as the name suggests, when learning is to be avoided, like in the investor example with this very able manager. But not only that, it's also useful when just the right amount of learning has to be done at just the right time, by just the right agents, as was the case when we considered different managers with these different learning cost functions and these sort of comparative advantages in learning. And with that, I'm at the end of my slides. So I'll be happy to take any questions. Yes,
Can
please.
I go ahead and ask? Yeah. I think this is very interesting. I'm just wondering how easy is this to calculate, like to compute? And I understand the yeah, of course, you get these nice results, but how? And I understand that, okay, you only need to know as you are increasing the number of actions, then you just need to know the equivalent, the ignorance equivalent from the previous set you had, right? But how will I get to know that? And if I have several portfolios, for example, that would be, yeah.
Yes. Thank you. So yes, you are absolutely right to point out, maybe as a concept, the definition is simple, but figuring out it sort of still is related to the optimal learning strategy, which is both a strength and a hindrance, right? The strength is that you have all these connections, but the hindrance is in many situations, in fact, computing the rationally inattentive choice is computationally quite demanding, even in the nicest case of Shannon entropy. And so first, I want to acknowledge that this is no silver bullet, okay? We weren't able to compute it before explicitly. We still are not. Otherwise, it would be weird, okay? So there's no closed form description of the ignorance equivalent, except if like learning is free or like other maybe very special cases. But if we think about computation, I think there's still some things that we can do. The most important thing here is that we have this description of the ignorance equivalent that relies only on binary choice, okay? So if we want to characterize the ignorance equivalent vector, we could just say it's a vector that when you add this vector to each agent in each action individually, so you just have a vector that you think might be the ignorance equivalent, and you check when I have this action and another action, am I better off? Would I unconditionally implement the candidate ignorance equivalent? If the answer is yes against each individual action, then this payoff vector would in fact be implemented unconditionally against all actions at the same time. And so you can also say that the ignorance equivalent is the least attractive in terms of expected utility under the prior payoff vector that has this property. So that will already reduce a little bit, and you can get some optimality conditions that way. And then you can use an additional thing, which is you don't have to determine, even in these binary situations, what is the fully optimal strategy. Because all you need to determine is when you go from unconditional implementation of your candidate ignorance equivalent to having that with probability 1 minus epsilon, and the other one at some specific prior with marginal probability epsilon, that you do not do better. And so in a nutshell, you can define for each other action sort of what would be the most attractive posterior to implement it against your candidate ignorance equivalent. And then just think about sort of marginally as you place just epsilon wealth on it, you get better off. And so then you actually end up at optimality conditions. So you have a minimizing expected utility problem where the set of feasible payoff vector is characterized each one by a single inequality. That's that the marginal gain in welfare that you have if you put just marginal weight on the other particular action with probability, like with epsilon probability, does not go up. So you have then however many actions you have inequalities and expected utility maximization over that. At that point, it becomes a little bit more suggestive because what we try to argue and what I plan to do but haven't done yet is to show that this in fact can be implemented to yield more efficient algorithms to do. We have done it, basically pursued that idea for Shannon entropy costs. That's a different paper. It's called Geometric Methods for Rational Inattention. And it turns out that actually in that case, I know the algorithm compared to the widely used Plahuta-Rimoto algorithm, and also compared to the algorithm put forth in the paper by Young, Sims, Mateka, and somebody else, is faster and more accurate. So you can either say we fix the number of times that it runs, or we sort of fix a target accuracy. So it gives us computational benefits too. And from a theory point, equally interesting, not only does it actually help us get closer to the actual true optimum, we can also use it to get measures for how far off we are. So sort of be able to make robust, because for example, a key feature of rationally attentive choice is that agents, even if they have access to 100 different portfolios, they only place their wealth in 1 out of 5. And so oftentimes you're only interested in figuring out what's the consideration set, what's the set of actions that's being chosen with positive probability. And if you have a noisy thing, you might be able to say, okay, these actions are chosen often, but I can't rule out the other ones. But if you have this more geometric approach, you can say things like, okay, the optimal choice predicts I use these 5 portfolios, but I can also say with 99.9% probability, you will never place more than epsilon weight, whatever epsilon you want to choose, on these 700 actions. So I can also give sort of confidence set over the actions chosen with positive probability. So that's something that it can help us do.